The advice that I give for the upcoming eighth graders is to get good grades.
Yes.
My advice for next year's eighth graders is one bad grade doesn't define you.
Advice for next year's eighth graders is be you and try to stay on top of your grades.
Advice for next year's eighth graders is to try new things.
You guys gotta lock in and prepare for high school.
My advice for the next year's eighth grade is to just don't be bad and don't get in trouble.
My advice to the eighth graders next year is to do whatever you can.
Advice for the next year eighth graders is don't get in trouble.
My advice for the upcoming eighth graders is not to have fake friends and just have to have fun.
Graders is to just have fun and stay out of drama.
Advice for the upcoming eighth graders is don't be friends with bad people.
My advice for the upcoming eighth graders is to just stay to yourself.
My advice would be just focus on your work. It's easy. It's not that hard.
My advice for next year's eighth graders is don't worry too much about the classes. It's not as hard as you think.
Nothing really matters, so just be yourself and yeah.
Next year's eighth graders is to join band, preferably play trombone.
My advice for next year's eighth graders is don't stress and be kind.
My advice for next year's eighth grade is don't be a goof in class and at least listen to your teachers.
My advice for next year's eighth graders is stay organized and do your work.
My advice for next year eighth graders is to focus on yourself.
My advice for next year's eighth graders is definitely don't fall behind on your work because you get a lot of it.
My advice for next year's eighth graders is to not stress because it's really easy.
Hi, my name's Zachary, and my advice for next year's eighth graders is I would say good luck and just don't be afraid to ask for help.
My advice to the next year eighth graders is to keep up with your work.
Advice for next year's eighth graders is to do your work so you don't fail all your classes.
My advice for eighth grade next year is to be nice to your peers.
My advice for eighth graders next year is just do your work.
My advice for the eighth graders is to do all your work at school because you could miss out on really cool stuff like end of the year trips.
My advice for the next eighth graders are stay focused and focus on your grades.
My advice for the next year eighth graders are you need to make sure you be good to the teachers because they don't know how they're going to treat you. So if you're good, you would probably set a good example for them and they would treat you better.
My advice for next year eighth grade is to have fun.
My advice for the next year eighth graders is to be nice to all your teachers because they could fail you.
My advice for next year's eighth graders is to always be kind to others and the people below you and always smile.
My advice to the sixth graders for me is have fun with your friends but still put effort into your schoolwork.
My advice for next year's eighth graders is to stay on top of your work and finish the year strong.
My favorite memory at Kennedy is hanging out with my friends.
My advice for next year's eighth graders would be to turn your work on time and get all your stuff in.
My advice for next year's eighth grade is to get your work done and make sure everything's turned in because this grade counts.
My advice for the next year's eighth grade class is, stay on top of your A game, keep up with the work because it goes really fast, especially social studies.
Hi, I'm Luna Till, and my advice for next year's 8th grade class is to basically just participate in the community, whether it be band, choir, sports, just anything. Because at the end of the day, you're going to want to have something to look forward to, whether it be after homework, after a test, just something. And you're going to want to build bonds in that community too. So.
Advice for next year's 8th grade is just don't mess around.
My advice to next year's 8th graders is to just be yourself.